This is a PowerSpec B708, and I found it in a dumpster. It might not look like it from the outside, but this thing is absolutely filthy. I wanted to see if I could take this thing from the fire hazard it is now to a properly functioning machine, and in this video we'll be trying to do just that. Just a warning, this video is going to be a long one. I'll be disassembling and deep cleaning a PC from start to finish, which can take a while. Let's start by opening up the PowerSpec and having a look inside. There are 4 screws on the back of most PC cases you can unscrew to remove the side panels. You can see this one side panel has a tube and a grate for ventilation placed right over the CPU cooler, which is a nice feature on a consumer grade PC. It makes sure that the components have a decent amount of airflow. Now that it's open, we can see how truly dirty this thing is. The motherboard is where all the components of the computer come together, and is where all the ports for all the cables sit, basically where all the connections happen. There's an extremely thick layer of dust covering certain parts of the board, especially around the CPU and its cooler. The bottom of the case is also covered in a nice thick layer of dust, as well as the hard drive, which sits mounted on the left side. At this point, I'm realizing that I have to completely disassemble the PC in order to clean it. I'm not comfortable trying to clean it just by blowing compressed air right into the case, because I know there's no way I can get all the dust out by doing so. This thing needs a proper deep clean. If you're following along cleaning your PC while watching this video, be sure to start by unplugging your machine. I never even tried to plug this thing in because of how dusty it is, but it's always good to have a reminder. So I'll start by removing the hard drive. In this machine is a 3.5-inch hard drive which contains a physically spinning apparatus that's very fragile. I'm going to carefully remove it by taking out the 2 screws on one side. There are 2 on this front side, and there will be 2 on the back side that will have to come out as well if we want to remove the whole thing. There are also 2 cables that need to be disconnected. One is for data and the other is for power. All you need to do to disconnect these cables is for the power plug, just pull straight away from the device itself and it'll come right out. For SATA cables, they'll sometimes have a clip, so make sure you hold that down and pull and you should be good to go. I'll show you how to reconnect these cables in more detail later. Next, I'll be removing the exhaust fan. This only has 1 cable that supplies its power, which will also need to come off. A gentle pull on the plug will pull it right away from its socket. This computer must have been sitting under a desk or somewhere extremely dusty, because this is the dirtiest I've ever seen a computer. You can tell by the exhaust fan how much dust was actually on the inside. It's pretty crazy. The front panel of this computer has an optical drive for CD writing and reading, as well as an SD card reader. These will have to come out as well, and they'll have screws above where the hard drive is sitting. As we can see, these are really dusty as well. I'm going to disconnect this 24-pin connector that supplies power to the motherboard. It's a bit tricky to remove because it's so crowded on this side of the case, but some firm wiggling in each direction will do the trick eventually. There is a rat's nest of cables over here, and most of them are extra. You can see they're zip tied together. These connectors just push into place, so pulling them apart will separate them. Next to come out is the power supply. This beefy boy supplies power to the whole machine and is really heavy. For some reason, manufacturers thought it would be a good idea to mount these at the top of the case. It's not a decision that I would have made, but that's beside the point. 4 screws hold it in place, and removing them will allow it to come out. Just be careful and keep one hand under it in the case while you're unscrewing the screws, so it doesn't fall and crush everything underneath it. This, as you might have guessed, is also super dusty. It's got a little fan of its own on the back of the case that has probably been pulling in dusty air as well. Down to the last few components here, we have the CPU fan. These screws are really long since they go all the way through the cooler and out the back of the motherboard, so unscrewing these might take a while. This is the worst component in the whole machine when it comes to dust. The warmth of the heatsink probably made it easier for dust to cling to it, and the fins with their small spaces and gaps in between aren't doing any favors. Unfortunately, this model of cooler is clipped into place to the heatsink, and I won't be able to take the fan off and clean it separately. Next out is the RAM. Take note of which slots the RAM is installed, since we'll want to put them back where they came from. We want to use this computer in dual channel mode, which will give us access to more RAM. So that's why we need them in the right spot. I'll take out the Wi-Fi card, which is attached by just 1 screw on the bottom, and then slide out the front panel components. Most front panels on cases will come off if you pull on one end, just like this one. Before you do this, you'll have to pull out all the connections on the motherboard. There's usually a few connections that the front panel makes on the motherboard. There are a couple things in this case from the front panel that connect to the motherboard, so we have to remove them in order to avoid damaging the ports. Because there are so many devices, including an optical drive, an SD card reader, and the power button, I'll have to navigate these cables through the case. There's actually a hole in the case meant for these cables. A set of 6 screws hold the motherboard in place, and once those are out, the motherboard can come free. So now we have all our components sitting in a cardboard box. We'll be taking these outside to clean them so I'm not getting dust all over my house. Before we move on, I'll go over some of the tools I use to clean the computer. There aren't many, just microfiber rags, 91% isopropyl alcohol, a lens brush, a toothbrush, compressed air, and a set of screwdrivers. I actually started this video with the intent of comparing this electric duster to a can of compressed air. I've used compressed air a lot. It's good for cleaning out computers that are kept up. They've been cleaned every few months or so. But since we need to lift dust off a surface rather than just blowing it off like we would with compressed air, I needed a more hardcore solution. I bought this duster just for this project and I found it to work really well. I'll be using it for 95% of the cleaning that I'm doing to this PC, and it just made life much easier. It cost about 60 bucks, and I probably would have spent hundreds on cans of compressed air just to get the same quality of cleanliness. It has a bunch of attachments, including a brush one, which I love, that allows you to remove dust from surfaces gently and get in between cracks on small surfaces. If you want to check it out for yourself, I've left a link in the description. Now, back to the cleaning. I went to Target to find compressed air, and they only had this brand of air. Normally, the straws that come with these are much longer and better for reaching in the small crannies of components. You might be able to do better with a longer straw, but I would say this bottle is like a 3 out of 10. You can see that it moves the dust, but it's really inconsistent. It says that it's moisture free, but you can see that there's stuff getting all over the motherboard. Like I said earlier, we have to actually lift the dust off the components, which makes a brush attachment way more useful, like the one that comes with the vacuum. It's a bit hard to see because of my shadow in this part, but the electric duster handles this dust quite easily. I spent a lot of time working on the CPU cooler because it was so dusty, and I even switched back to the compressed air because it had the tiny hose that would fit in between the fins. This will probably never get clean without submerging it in something or finding a tiny hose that you can use. I think I got it close enough between the combination of the electric duster and the compressed air. Next up for cleaning is the SD card reader and the exhaust fan. I worked on the power supply a little out here, but I dismantled it later on, which gave a better clean. The hard drive is really easy to clean considering its flat surface and relatively small size. And next up is a case cleaning montage. This was tricky to film because there are so many angles and nooks and crannies to fit the brush in, but it got the job done eventually. Now we're back inside, and I'm using the microfiber towel to wipe down surfaces and lift dust off the front panel. And here's what the power supply looks like when it's disassembled, which I haven't done before, so this was a new thing for me. This will void your warranty, so be careful if you decide to do it for yourself. This particular model is a 300-watt power supply, which is really small. If one were to add a graphics card to the computer, you'd probably need to upgrade the power supply. I use the brush here because I feel like these elements are delicate, and it was actually surprisingly clean on the inside, so I didn't even need the electric duster. The compressed air was also pretty good for moving air between the tiny components. Cleaning with thermal paste off the CPU requires a lot of alcohol and a bit of the toothbrush. There is a lot of old paste caked up along the edge, so I ended up scraping up a lot of it with a microfiber rag as well. And we discovered that it is, drumroll please, an i5 2500K. It's not bad. The K means that it's overclockable, and it's a 4-core, 4-thread CPU, which is a decent amount of power. I had a bit of a heart attack when I first saw the CPU socket for the first time, because I thought all the pins had been bent. If you look carefully, you'll see that they're all bent in one direction on each side of the CPU socket. Apparently this is just how they were designed, so no worries. Plop the CPU back in with the arrow on the CPU matching the arrow on the motherboard or the CPU socket. Next, I brushed out the RAM slots since they were filled with dust, and I did another pass on the CPU cooler, this time taking off the thermal paste. One more go at the SD card reader and the case, and it's time for reassembly. Start by adding the CPU to the board after applying thermal paste, which I've done already, and then use the screws to secure it to the board. A helpful tip is to alternate corners when you're screwing them in, so you get even distribution and your thermal paste is distributed evenly over your heat spreader. Insert the RAM by pushing firmly on the board and lining up the notch on the RAM to the notch on the motherboard. Then you can screw the motherboard back in place. Connect the 24-pin power supply now so that you can do it with a lot of room in the case while there's not many components. Then add the hard drive back in. I put it higher up this time to keep more cabling out of the way. And I'll connect both the power and the data cables back in. I'll put the front panel components in next, and you'll have to adjust them later, so leave the screws a little bit loose, enough so that they can slide back and forth. Then slot the power supply back in and run the cables back to the sockets that we removed them from before. The trickiest and worst bit is adding the cables back to the motherboard. I'll connect the exhaust fan or the rear fan to its slot just above the CPU. And then we have to connect the front panel in a couple of places, including this tiny set of single pins on the bottom right of the motherboard. This can actually make or break the machine because you have to connect the power button here. I found a motherboard diagram that helped me do this and line up my pins in the correct spot. So try to find the same and make sure you know where these pins should go on your board. It's important to get right. Next, I connected the Molex connector to the rear fan and we should be good to go. Now it's time to power this thing up. Things get a little messy from here, so I'll just take you on an overview. I spent a while trying to get it to power on with no success. This was because I had mapped two of the front panel pins to the wrong pins on the board, and the power button wasn't working. I saw a green LED on the board that thankfully indicated that the thing was actually working, but I had to play with some things to make sure that I could get it on. Once I did get it to turn on, I spent a night trying to get this thing to boot from its original hard drive. It would boot fine in safe mode, but I think there was something bugged with the software that kept overloading the drive upon boot, because it would work for a few seconds and then freeze like it was trying to do too many things at once. I have this SSD that's in the computer now that I bought for testing computers just like this. So I installed Windows to the SSD on the machine, and that worked great. It boots up really fast now. Now I could also format the hard drive to wipe the previous owner's data off. And as a bonus, we have a clean 1 terabyte hard drive. It's now fully operational and can run programs just fine. I wouldn't call this thing gaming capable because the integrated graphics are only Intel HD 3000, which are very outdated at this point. Apex Legends wouldn't even boot, and the same thing happened with Fortnite, only after I downloaded them, of course. They cited an error with the GPU, something with DirectX 11. I can only install DirectX 10 on this machine. It's kind of a complicated world. It's not really worth explaining. All you need to know is that you need a graphics card to play games on this thing. I could have put in an old AMD RX 580 that I used to use, but I don't have an adapter for Molex to 8-pin power, which I would have needed to power the card in the first place. I would have also had to put in another power supply, which would completely ruin the whole purpose of the test. It would just be another machine by that point. So could this be a gaming machine one day? If you spend a few $100 getting a new power supply and a graphics card, probably, but that's the case for many computers. Otherwise, all you'd be doing with this thing is watching YouTube videos and filling out spreadsheets. Although, if nothing else, I had a good time cleaning this thing out. I will take any excuse to disassemble a computer and put it back together again. So I found it an educational experience. I hope you did too. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of the video. A special thanks to everyone who is subscribed and watched the video, especially my most recent sub, Leonidas V. Thanks, buddy. If you enjoyed the content, join Leonidas in subscribing and hit the bell to get notified when videos go live. If you'd like to check out the electric duster I used for cleaning the power spec, check out the link in the description. I hope you found this video useful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.